Hello and welcome to Our American States, a podcast from the National Conference of State Legislatures. This podcast is all about legislatures, the people in them, the policies, process, and politics that shape them. I'm your host, Ed Smith.
It's a grind being in the legislature and having to deal with all the things that are pulling and tugging at you. But my message would be, it really is the greatest place in America for public service, which, let's be honest, that means it's the greatest place in the world.
That was Florida House Speaker Chris Sprowls, my guest on today's podcast. As a legislative leader in one of the nation's largest states, Sprowls is a busy guy. When we heard he was also hosting a podcast, he seemed like a perfect guest for this show. Sprowls' podcast, Red, White, and Blue, wrapped up its first 8-episode season on April 12th and featured authors ranging from Todd Rose, who wrote The End of Average, to Devil in the Grove author Gilbert King. Sprowls talked about why he decided to start the podcast, the opportunity to talk about issues in depth, and his favorite book from childhood. He also shares the biggest challenge to leaders in Florida. Here's our discussion. Mr. Speaker, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Ed. It's great to be with you.
I've had the opportunity to interview some legislative leaders on this podcast and for other work, and boy, those are busy jobs. And being speaker is especially busy. So let me ask you first, why would you take on this new podcast on top of everything else you have to do?
Yeah, my wife asked me that same question. I think it really had to do with, I was talking to my staff a bunch, and I read books. I'm an avid reader. I try to read books that are, at least connected or loosely connected to the things we could work on in the legislature. And I'm always going in and talking to them about it. And I think to a certain extent, they probably get a little bored and frustrated with me and said, why don't you do a podcast and actually talk to the people who wrote these books and really sort of dive deep, but also make the connections for people, right? You read these things, you work on a piece of policy, you work on something that becomes law because you have this vision for it based on something you read. And people never really know that backstory of how that came about or why it matters or why it's important or that you actually thought about it before law goes into effect and is signed. So this was a chance to do that, to really showcase, obviously, the great authors that I enjoy reading, but also who, at least in some way, contributed to our mission in the Florida House, what we've done, what we've worked on, how we've approached a problem, and really be able to tell the legislators, the staff, the public, people who were interested in it, how that took place and why it matters for them, their families, and our future as a state.
Well, it's always good to hear that staff are offering you sound advice. I'm wondering what kind of books you're focusing on. Is it all nonfiction, public policy stuff, or are you going further afield?
Yeah, I don't really think there's much of a limit. I think when I first approached it, it was, we had Todd Rose on the podcast who wrote several books, The End of Average, Dark Horse, which are really connected to workforce, to education policy as it relates to, expanding your workforce. We did one of the largest reworks of a workforce policy anywhere in the country. Todd's work contributed to that in a significant way. So there's that direct connection. And then there's, looser connections, right? Like, so you have Amanda Ripley, who, has written a lot about education policy, the smartest kids in the world and how they got that way. But she wrote this book recently called High Conflict, which we had her on the podcast. And, as politicians or staffers or people who work through the political process, high conflict is like lunchtime for us. And so it's something we're very used to. And she really approaches it from a really cool and interesting way. So I thought that had a nexus to certainly the work that we're doing. But I'm really open to anything. And I think that the reality is when you work in the political environment, it is about society. And there really isn't a limit to sort of the connections that you can make through the work of these great authors. So I've had folks like Mark Batterson, on the podcast, who's one of my favorite authors. He's a Christian author. He's a pastor of National Community Church up in Washington, D.C. He wrote a book called Win the Day about, how you approach life. And it was actually one of our sort of mottos internally in the speaker's office was Win the Day, based on that sort of mantra and that work about, you approach politics or lawmaking and you try to win the year. It's like impossible, but you might be able to win the day if you try. That was what his work was about. So I don't really think there's a limit. I enjoy history. I enjoy public policy. I think there's even some ways to maybe, meld in some nonfiction in there.
I know in an earlier conversation you mentioned 2034. I read that when it first came out. It's a pretty sobering book, especially in the current situation. Is that an example of a novel that you might bring to the podcast for a discussion?
Oh, I think absolutely. And what I meant to say before was, have some fiction. And this is, I think, a great example of 2034, which is really, setting up a fictional story of what a global war could look like between the United States, China, and the other players who might get involved. And I'll tell you, I was reading that book during session. It might have not been my best session pick. And, reading it before I go to bed, like halfway through, I go to sleep, wake up the next morning, do some things. And of course, check the news, check Twitter. And they're talking about, war games in the South China Sea and Taiwan. And you're thinking to yourself, oh my God, I've just read this book. And I think it's a really well done book about what a global conflict can be, clearly written by a couple of guys who, in addition to being good storytellers, are also trying to illustrate to people the geopolitical sensitivity of what's happening in China between the United States and the rest of the world, and how sensitive that could be. So I think books like that are really helpful. I just did a podcast with Michael Knowles, and we're talking about how people have really done a direct assault on the English language and speech and changing what words mean. And we started talking about 1984, and we started talking about Brave New Worlds by Huxley and how that relates to this conversation. Obviously, both of those were works of fiction, but they're works of fiction with sort of a societal and political purpose in mind. So I think that those can be wildly instructive. There's that old saying that life imitates art, and I think that holds true today.
I've read a great deal of Orwell, and I'd agree that some of his books and essays resonate with what we're experiencing today, almost eerily so. Now, I'm going to assume you were a big reader as a kid, and I wonder if there's any one book that stands out for you from your childhood or teen years.
I think as a kid, I think initially I really struggled to get interested in reading, which is probably why I've been so passionate about reading and literacy, because I think as a child, I wish it would have kind of caught on sooner. And I think if we can catch it on sooner with kids, it's going to completely change the way they view the world. But, as a kid, I think, C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe was probably the one that I enjoyed the most, or remember as for kind of your first, as my kids would say, your first chapter book. It's your first chapter book that really stuck with you, because there was so much going on. You have this, this new world. When you're a kid, we started this New Worlds Reading Initiative, which is the largest book delivery program and effort to get kids reading on grade level of any state in the country. And we called it New Worlds because I said it in the speech. But when we wrote that speech, I really had something like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe in mind, right? This idea that you're going to walk through a closet, a wardrobe, and you're going to enter this entire world, and there are villains, and there are goblins, and there's a fight for justice and truth, and there's this adventure, and you get to take part as a child in being part of the adventure. I think that's what we had in mind. So when I was a little kid, that's the book that probably started that for me.
Well, that's a great description of what makes reading so engaging, the ability to walk into another world. I want to ask you about the audience. Are you hoping to reach mainly your colleagues or Floridians generally, or maybe other lawmakers around the country?
I think yes to all. I think that certainly the people who are probably most likely to listen are going to be our colleagues, the folks who work in and out of the legislative process, particularly because we're trying to connect the dots for folks between what's out there in the literary world, what people are talking about and writing about versus what we've done in public policy. But I think if you're a book lover, if you like history, if you like thinking about problems, in sort of a non-traditional way that might get to a more nuanced and effective solution. I think if you're somebody who enjoys TED Talks or current events, I think really there is something in it for everybody. And we've tried to interview authors, not are just ones that I enjoyed or have relevance to us, but also are kind of a different sort of eclectic group where, regardless of what your sort of main interest is, if you're a true crime person, there's going to be somebody for you. I just interviewed Gilbert King, who's a Pulitzer Prize for Devil in the Grove, which will come out next week. If you're somebody who really appreciates the environment, environmental policy, environmental history, Jack Davis, who won the Pulitzer Prize for The Gulf, is part of the podcast. So we try to do a little bit of everything for everybody.
Well, it sounds like you've had some pretty far-reaching discussions. I'm curious about how it ties in with being speaker. Is it about being able to explain your take on a topic in a nuanced way and at the pace you want, not trying to get that across through a reporter or some other means?
Absolutely, right. It's we live in a political environment now where you got to convey your thoughts in 120 characters, and that's hard to do. And I think what ends up getting lost in that process is the nuance. And let's be honest, present company excluded, like people who were involved in this process, but the kind of mainstream media and things like that, they're not really interested in the nuance. Like, you really got to hang There's a difference between reading a tweet and reading an article in the Atlantic. One is going to take you a while. One is super quick. And people really don't have the patience to kind of hang and see it all. But I think it's important when you're talking about public policy that you can show and demonstrate the thought that went into it, how you've connected maybe an idea to the practical. I mean, one thing I think is really difficult. You read books about public policy, and usually they highlight the problem really well. It's well documented, well researched, and then you get to sort of the solutions, and it's kind of like, and I don't know, here's some ideas to get you started. They're not, we don't really know though. And I do think that there's this huge gap between the idea, the problem, and how do you solve it, and how do you come up with a solution. So, I think that one of the kind of neat parts for me and what we're trying to illustrate through the podcast is you can take from the outside world, from people who are engaged in the research, doing the thoughtful work, and then get our people who are experts, our members who are experts, our staff members who are experts, the experts that we bring in from all parts of Florida, and then work on the solution to the problems that have been so well articulated. And that's been really one of the most fun and rewarding parts for me.
Mr. Speaker, thank you. We're going to take a quick break and then come back with the rest of our discussion.
Make Denver your destination for this year's NCSL Legislative Summit. Connect with legislative colleagues August 1st through the 3rd to gain unique insights and practical knowledge to drive results for your state. Early bird pricing is available through June 13th. Register today at www.ncsl.org.
While I have you, I'd like to ask you about Florida. What would you put on the top of your list for your biggest challenges in Florida in 2022?
Our biggest challenge is success. And, that sounds like a super biased comment coming from a guy who, leads a legislative chamber in the state. But let me give some context to it. The success of Florida means what? It means that you are leading the nation in domestic migration. It means that people, when they decide they're going to leave their home state and they're going to go somewhere else, a good sizable portion of them are coming here to the state of Florida. And that success creates challenges. It creates challenges in transportation. It creates challenges in, meeting the needs in education. During my last year as speaker, we passed the largest expansion of school choice in the history of the United States of America. That's obviously something we feel very strongly about, very passionately about. But it's also a response to the fact that we realize all these folks are coming here and we need to provide as many educational options and empowerment for families as possible. The investments that we make in public transportation or in healthcare, the fact that we realize that because people are now moving their businesses here. When I was growing up in Florida in the early 90s, Ed, people, Florida was sort of like the carrot at the end of the life well lived. If you did well and you raised your kids and you saved for retirement, you get to come and you get to move to the villages in Florida and play pickleball and play golf and, live the dream. That's not the case anymore. I mean, we still have that. The villages are doing very well. They're expanding. But, Florida is well beyond that now. You have people who are running major hedge funds, major businesses, major manufacturing entities who are coming to the state to raise their families and to build their business and build prosperity, which means that we've had to now look at how are we going to expand our workforce to meet the rapidly expanding nature of our business community, which is why, as I mentioned with that podcast with Todd Rose, we passed the REACH Act, which is we really blew up the workforce system and completely started over because it was broken. So those are our challenges. They're a result of success, but the challenges are real. And I really believe over the last, year and a half, we've stepped up in a major way to meet them.
When I was growing up in New England, and I am considerably older than you are, the perception of Florida was just as you describe it. But it's a very different place now. But let me get back to books. What was your favorite book of the last year or so, even if it's not one that made it onto your podcast?
Oh, that's a good one. That's like, picking between like your favorite children. I'll give you one that I feel like I probably wouldn't maybe, have on the podcast, but I think is really a fascinating story, true story, called The Greatest Beer Run Ever. And, if you can picture this scene, it's like a bunch of guys hanging out at their favorite pub, in New York City during Vietnam, talking about their buddies who they had up on the wall who were in Vietnam, fighting in Vietnam. The barkeep, the owner of the bar, is talking about we need to thank our boys. We need to tell them how much we appreciate them. And they're, everybody's, holding up their beer and they're like, yeah, we got to do that. And he says, well, one of us should just go over there and thank them in person. So this one guy, who's one of the guys he's also a merchant seaman, a merchant marine at the time. He goes, well, I'll go. So they get a collection of their favorite beers from New York City. And this guy puts it in his backpack, gets on a merchant ship headed for, Southeast Asia to Vietnam, arrives wearing his merchant clothes, and then systematically goes up to people, like guy who's got to buy a helicopter and go, hey, are you by any chance going to this region? I hear I got got a guy there I want to talk to. And this guy's getting hitchhiking through Vietnam, courtesy of the United States military. It turns out they all think he's CIA, which is why he's dressed like that. And he's out there finding his buddies and delivering them beer, in a foxhole, saying, hey, man, just wanted to come see you. The boys said, thanks. Here's a beer. And I just think it's such a cool story. It's a true story. But you want to talk about, acts of friendship and acts of loyalty. Imagine, flying across sailing across the country to a war-torn area to go find your buddies just to say thanks. I think that's pretty cool.
Okay, I'm going to check that out. Sounds like it's a good read. As you know, we have an audience of legislators and legislative staffers, mainly. Any parting thoughts to share with them from your perch as speaker in one of the largest states?
It's a great question. And here's what I've said, and I've said this often, and I've always used it in the context of Florida, but I think it holds true to a lot of different states. I believe that serving in the state legislature, whether you're a staff member who presumably took that job because you wanted to make a difference, you wanted it to matter when it comes to running your state, or you're a legislator, it is one of the last great places in America for public service. And I say that because, look at Washington, D.C., right? It's sort of like the opposite of being in the state legislature. You really can't get anything done. The place is completely broken and dysfunctional. And yet when you come home and you're in the grocery store, everybody knows who you are. Right? Being in the legislature is like the opposite. You can go up to your legislature. You can accomplish an amazing amount. You can transform your state in a really short period of time. And then you go home, you're buying milk, and nobody's got a clue who you are for the most part. That's a cool thing, to be able to effectuate change on a mass scale without really altering your life in a really significant way. So I would just say, I know it's hard. It's a grind being in the legislature and having to deal with all the things that are pulling and tugging at you. But my message would be, it really is the greatest place in America for public service, which, let's be honest, that means it's the greatest place in the world. Try to remind yourself of that when you go to work, and go to win the day. Don't try to win the year. Just win the session. And if you do that session over session, you're gonna transform your state and create opportunities for your people.
Well, that's a wonderful note to go out on, especially for NCSL. Thanks so much for taking the time to talk books. Take care.
You too. Thanks, Ed. Appreciate it.
And that concludes this episode of our podcast. We encourage you to review and rate NCSL podcasts on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Pocket Casts, Stitcher, or Spotify. We also encourage you to check out our other podcasts, Legislatures, The Inside Story, and the special series, Building Democracy. Thanks for listening.